Butler was murdered on November 16, 2022, by her enraged ex-girlfriend Shakyia Perkins, who refused to allow Corneisha to be successful and happy without her. She harassed and threatened Corneisha for a number of months. Shakyia had gone to Corneisha's house only a few days before the murder and set fire to her pink Mercedes and Jeep, two of Corneisha's most prized possessions. It is quite evident that Shakyia intended to ruin Corneisha's life, and in the end, she was successful in accomplishing her goal by robbing Corneisha of the one thing that was most valuable to her: her life.
It began with a scream that shattered the quiet night in South Fulton, Georgia. A sound that neighbors would never forget. It was just after sunset on November 17, 2022, when the 911 calls started pouring in. A woman had been shot inside her own home. A child, terrified, sobbing, barely able to speak, was the one who made the call. "My mommy's not moving," the voice trembled. When first responders arrived, the scene was chaos wrapped in silence. The door was half open, lights flickering inside. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. On the living room floor lay 33-year-old Corneisha Butler, a mother of 4, her life taken in an instant. Her children were nearby, crying, shaking, their eyes wide in disbelief. The home that once echoed with laughter and bedtime stories had become a crime scene. Detectives moved cautiously through the house, piecing together what had just happened. The front window was shattered, a few shell casings scattered near the doorway. It didn't look like a break-in. It looked personal. Whoever had done this knew her and wanted her gone. As the flashing blue lights painted the walls of the neighborhood, one name surfaced immediately: Shakyia Perkins. To police, she wasn't an unfamiliar name. In fact, her file was thick, filled with reports, restraining orders, and warnings that now seemed like prophecies. For months, Corneisha had been trying to escape her ex-girlfriend's grasp. Friends said she feared this would happen. She'd spoken of the threats, the stalking, the late-night calls that never stopped. There had been police visits, even a protective order, but like so many victims of domestic violence, Corneisha had learned a painful truth. A piece of paper can't always stop a bullet. By dawn, her death was on every local station. A mother of 4, gunned down in front of her children. The anchors repeated, their voices heavy with disbelief. But behind those headlines was something deeper. A pattern of warnings ignored, of systems stretched too thin, and of a love that had curdled into obsession. Neighbors stood on their lawns, whispering the same question. How did it come to this? How did a woman who had already begged for protection end up dead in her own home? For the detectives, that question would drive every step of the investigation. And as they followed the trail, from restraining orders to prior arrests, from broken trust to broken glass, one thing would become painfully clear. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a slow-burning tragedy, years in the making, one that everyone saw coming, yet no one could stop. And at the center of it all was Corneisha Butler, a devoted mother, a survivor, and a woman whose final moments would expose the cracks in a system meant to protect her. Before her name became another headline, Corneisha Butler was simply known as Nisha to those who loved her. A woman with a radiant smile and a laugh that filled every room she walked into. She grew up in Georgia, a southern soul with deep roots in family and faith. Friends describe her as the kind of person who would give you her last dollar, the kind who'd stay up all night talking if she thought it might ease your pain. To her 4 children, she was everything: the protector, the provider, the person who made sure birthdays were special even when money was tight. Every morning, she'd wake before sunrise, getting the kids ready for school, braiding her daughter's hair, packing lunches, humming to herself in the kitchen. Life wasn't easy, but she made it feel steady, safe. Corneisha had dreams beyond her daily grind. She talked about going back to school, maybe starting a small business one day. Her friends said she wanted something that would give her family a better life, something she could call her own. But life, as it often does, threw obstacles in her path, and one of those obstacles came in the form of love that turned dangerous. She met Shakyia Perkins years earlier, and in the beginning it felt real. Shakyia was charming, funny, someone who made her feel seen. Their connection grew fast, too fast, some said. For a while, they built a life together, raising kids under one roof, laughing at the small things, posting photos that painted a picture of happiness. But behind the smiles were arguments that got louder, jealousy that grew darker, and a tension that Corneisha tried to hide from everyone around her. Family members would later say that she started to change. She became quieter, more cautious. She stopped talking about certain things, stopped inviting people over. When she did open up, it was usually to say that she was handling it. But the bruises, emotional and sometimes physical, told a different story. Corneisha had started trying to rebuild her independence. She wanted out. She wanted peace. That's when the threats began. Friends said she'd receive late-night messages, angry phone calls, and once, she woke up to find her car burned in the driveway. A warning she could no longer ignore. It was then that she filed for a restraining order, hoping it would bring distance, safety, and calm. But the fear never really left. Even after police got involved, she would look over her shoulder, double-check her locks, and pray every night that tomorrow would be different. To the world, Corneisha was a strong, beautiful mother doing her best to protect her children. But inside, she was living a quiet war, one between her desire for peace and the shadow of someone who refused to let her go. The first red flag didn't come with a scream or a bruise. It came disguised as love, possessive, protective, but slowly tightening like a noose. Friends remembered the early signs. Shakyia's constant check-ins, the need to know where Corneisha was, who she was with, what she was doing. First, it seemed like care, but over time, it became surveillance. If Corneisha didn't answer a call, Shakyia would show up. If she posted a photo online, Shakyia would question who was in the background. Jealousy became the language of their relationship, and fear became its heartbeat. By the time Corneisha realized what was happening, the walls had already closed in. The woman she once loved had turned into someone she barely recognized. Volatile, unpredictable, and obsessed with control. Friends and family pleaded with her to leave, but anyone who's ever been trapped in a cycle of abuse knows it isn't that simple. Love turns to fear, fear turns to confusion, and confusion becomes the cage. When she finally left, it wasn't quiet. It was chaos. Threats filled her phone. Shakyia followed her to work. Sometimes, she'd be waiting outside the house, yelling in the street, daring Corneisha to call the police. The breaking point came one night when Corneisha's car, a Mercedes-Benz she'd worked hard to buy, went up in flames. It was more than vandalism. It was a message. If I can't have you, no one will. That night changed everything. Corneisha finally filed for a restraining order, her hands shaking as she signed the papers. She told the court that she feared for her life. The judge agreed and set strict boundaries. Shakyia was not to come within 200 yards of her. But in South Fulton, where domestic cases pile up faster than they can be processed, enforcement is often a wish, not a promise. Even after the order, the threats didn't stop. Neighbors would see Shakyia's car drive slowly down the street. Sometimes, Corneisha would receive calls from unknown numbers, silent on the other end. Her friends said she lived on edge, locking doors, checking windows, keeping her phone charged just in case she needed to call 911. In her heart, she wanted to believe the worst was behind her. She was trying to move forward, to rebuild. But every time she took a step, the shadow followed. The system told her she was safe, but the fear told her otherwise. And perhaps the most tragic part of all, she knew this story too well. She'd seen others like her on the news, women who did everything right, who filed the papers, who called the police, who asked for help, and still ended up as headlines. Corneisha hoped she wouldn't be one of them. But deep down, she could feel it. The storm was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. November 17, 2022. A date that would forever haunt the Butler family. The day began like any other. Corneisha got her kids ready for school, fixed breakfast, and tried to shake off the unease that had been following her for months. She had started to find small pockets of peace. Time with her children, evenings spent laughing at cartoons, moments where life felt normal again. But that calm was an illusion, the final quiet before everything unraveled. That evening, The air in South Fulton hung thick with humidity. Neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices near Corneisha's home, though no one thought much of it at first. Arguments happened. Couples fought. But this wasn't an argument. It was a countdown. Sometime after sunset, Shakyia Perkins showed up at Corneisha's door. No one knows exactly what was said in those first few moments, but witnesses described shouting, sharp, desperate, and full of rage. Shakyia had ignored every warning, every order, every plea to stay away. And this time she came armed. The children were inside. They heard the voices rise, then the unmistakable sound of gunfire, a sound that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. One shot, then another, and then silence. When police arrived, the scene was horrific. Corneisha lay motionless on the floor, multiple gunshot wounds ending a life that had been spent protecting others. Her youngest child was in the corner, crying, calling her name. Officers had to pull the kids away, shielding their eyes from a reality no child should ever see. Outside, neighbors gathered in disbelief. Flashing blue lights painted the quiet street. Some wept, others stood frozen, replaying every red flag they had witnessed. The arguments, the stalking, the fear in Corneisha's eyes. Everyone knew she had tried to get help. Everyone knew she'd been living in danger. And now it was too late. Detectives quickly identified Shakyia Perkins as the prime suspect. Her name was already familiar. Her file filled with previous domestic violence charges, including arson, assault, and harassment. She had been out on bond, ordered to stay away from Corneisha, yet that night, she walked right up to the door. As word spread through the community, outrage followed. How could someone with so many warnings, so many prior charges, still be free? How could the system fail a woman who had done everything right? The restraining order, the police calls, the court visits, none of it stopped what happened in that house. By the next morning, news outlets carried the story. Mother of 4 gunned down by ex-girlfriend in front of her children. The photos showed a smiling Corneisha, radiant and alive. A heartbreaking contrast to the reality that now defined her story. What had begun as love had ended in blood. And as investigators began piecing together the timeline, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was the final act of obsession, control, and rage. The investigation began before dawn, under the cold blue glow of police lights that still illuminated the street outside Corneisha's home. Detectives from the South Fulton Police Department worked methodically, documenting every bullet casing, every shattered piece of glass, every detail that might tell them how the night had unfolded. But in truth, they already knew who they were looking for. The name Shakyia Perkins appeared in their system within minutes. A name that had shown up again and again in past reports. Domestic violence, arson, harassment, threats. The officers who'd been on previous calls to Corneisha's address recognized it instantly. One of them whispered, "We warned this would happen." Police issued an alert almost immediately. Shakyia's vehicle, a dark sedan, had been spotted leaving the area around the time of the shooting. Witnesses described seeing her speeding away, headlights off, disappearing into the night. Within hours, state troopers and city patrols were on high alert. It wasn't just a manhunt. It was a desperate race to catch someone who had already proven how dangerous she could be. Meanwhile, forensic teams inside the house found signs of forced entry. Not through the door, but through a window she may have broken or pushed open to get inside. There were footprints, shell casings, and a shattered phone near the victim's body. Detectives believed Corneisha had tried to call for help, but it was too late. At the precinct, officers replayed the timeline, the restraining order, the prior arrest, the bail conditions. Each piece painted a damning picture. This was a system failure. Perkins had been out on bond despite 4 pending domestic violence cases, including one involving the same victim. A restraining order had told her to stay 200 yards away, but she ignored it. And because she hadn't yet gone to trial, the courts couldn't revoke her bond until it was too late. By mid-morning, the suspect was in custody. Police tracked her down at a relative's house several miles away. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. According to the arrest report, she looked calm, detached, as if the weight of what she had done hadn't yet sunk in. In the interrogation room, detectives said little. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself, the weapon recovered, the eyewitness accounts, the digital trail of threats leading up to the murder. Shakyia's phone contained dozens of messages sent to Corneisha, some filled with anger, some with pleading, and others chillingly prophetic. "You'll regret leaving me." When investigators left the room, one veteran detective reportedly muttered, "We failed her," and that truth hung heavy in the air. Outside the police station, reporters gathered, the story already spreading across Georgia. A woman killed by her ex, after filing for protection. It was the kind of headline that sounded familiar because it was another life lost in the cracks of a broken system. The courtroom was silent the day Shakyia Perkins was brought before the judge. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and family members filled the benches. Some clutching photos of Corneisha Butler, others holding back tears. The air felt heavy, thick with grief and disbelief. This wasn't just another case. It was the aftermath of a tragedy everyone had seen coming. Prosecutors laid out the story with haunting precision. They showed the timeline, the domestic abuse, the restraining order, the bond violations, and the final fatal act. They described how Corneisha had lived in fear, how she'd done everything she could to protect herself, and how those efforts were undone by a system that failed to take danger seriously enough. The evidence was overwhelming. The murder weapon matched the casings found at the scene. Forensic reports confirmed gunshot residue on Perkins' hands. Surveillance footage from nearby homes placed her car near the house just minutes before the shots were fired. And perhaps most damning of all were the text messages. The threats, the desperate apologies, the chilling words that now read like a confession written in real time. The defense tried to paint a picture of emotional instability, that Perkins had snapped, that she'd been under mental distress. But the jury saw through it. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was a choice made over time, fueled by obsession and control. During the trial, Corneisha's mother took the stand. Her voice trembled as she told the court about her daughter's final weeks, how she had begged for help, how she had shown her family the restraining order and said, "Now I can finally sleep at night." The mother paused, then whispered, "She thought she was safe." The courtroom fell silent. Some jurors wiped their eyes. Even the judge looked down, his expression heavy. After days of testimony, it took the jury only a few hours to reach a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and cruelty to children. When the sentence was read aloud, life in prison with the possibility of parole, there was no outburst, no relief. Only silence. Perkins sat motionless, staring at the table in front of her. She didn't look up as she was led away in handcuffs. For her, it was over. But for Corneisha's family, the sentence did little to ease the pain. Justice, in its coldest form, had arrived, but far too late to save the woman they loved. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Corneisha's mother once more. Through tears, she spoke softly. "My baby did everything right. She got the restraining order. She called for help, but the system let her down. Now, I just want people to remember her. Not as a victim, but as a mother, as a fighter, as love." Her words echoed the truth so many families know. Justice after death is never enough. In the days following the verdict, South Fulton was wrapped in quiet sorrow. Candles flickered along the sidewalk outside Corneisha Butler's home, hundreds of them. Friends, neighbors, and strangers gathered to honor her memory, their faces lit by the soft, trembling glow of vigil flames. They remembered her laugh, the kind that filled a room, and the way she loved her children, fiercely and endlessly. Photos of her surrounded by her kids were placed at the center of the memorial, beside flowers and handwritten notes. Some read, "You deserved better." Others simply said, "Justice for Corneisha." The grief rippled through the community, but so did anger. Many couldn't understand how this had been allowed to happen. The restraining order, the previous arrests, the court records, all the warnings had been there. Advocates for domestic violence victims spoke out, demanding reform. They argued that Corneisha's death wasn't an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of a deeper, systemic failure. one where victims' cries for help too often go unanswered until it's too late. Local news stations interviewed members of her family. Her sister spoke softly, her eyes tired but fierce. She was trying to start over, she said. She was getting her life back. But no matter how much she tried to escape, that monster kept coming back. Her words struck a chord. Across Georgia, domestic violence organizations began pushing harder for legislation, stronger enforcement of restraining orders, stricter bond conditions for repeat offenders, and better protection for victims of same-sex domestic violence, an issue that often went overlooked. At her funeral, the church overflowed. The sound of gospel music filled the room as her children sat in the front pew, surrounded by family. Her eldest, barely a teenager, held a photo of his mother, smiling, alive, radiant. The pastor spoke of faith, forgiveness, and the courage it takes to leave an abusive relationship. But even his words couldn't disguise the undercurrent of anger that hung in the air. Outside, when the casket was lowered, the crowd fell into silence. The only sounds were the cries of her children and the quiet promise murmured by those who loved her most, that her story wouldn't be forgotten. In the months that followed, people in the community began to say her name in conversations about change. Her story was shared online, sparking discussions about how domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about gender, orientation, or background. It only thrives in silence. And while Corneisha Butler's life was cut short, her legacy began to grow. A painful reminder of the cost of inaction and the strength of a woman who tried, again and again, to survive. Because even in death, her voice still echoes through South Fulton, a whisper that says, "Believe victims the first time they ask for help." The story of Corneisha Butler is not just the story of a single tragedy. It is the story of every victim who begged for protection and never truly received it. It is the story of how love can be twisted into control, how fear can grow inside the walls of a home, and how silence from a system meant to protect can become deadly. In the weeks after her death, her name spread beyond Georgia. Shared across social media, mentioned in domestic violence awareness campaigns, invoked in conversations about justice reform. People who had never met her felt the weight of her story. They saw their sisters, their daughters, their friends in her face. They saw themselves. Her murder exposed the cracks that too often swallow victims whole. A restraining order is only as strong as the paper it's printed on. A bond condition means nothing if it's not enforced. And a victim's voice, no matter how loud, can still be drowned out by bureaucracy and indifference. Corneisha had done everything she was supposed to do. She reported, she filed, she trusted the system. And in the end, that trust cost her life. In interviews after the sentencing, her mother said she didn't want vengeance. She wanted change. If one woman can be saved because people remember Corneisha, she said, then her death won't be in vain. Those words became a rallying cry, a demand that echoed through the community and beyond. Even now, years later, her home remains a quiet memorial. Flowers still appear on the porch, left by strangers who never knew her but felt her story deeply. Her children are being raised by family, surrounded by love, taught that their mother's strength lives within them. They speak her name often, not with fear, but with pride. True crime stories like this one force us to look at the darkest corners of human emotion. Obsession, control, rage, and ask how they grow unchecked. But they also remind us of something else. The resilience of those who fight to survive, even when the world turns away. As the last chapter of this story closes, we're left with haunting questions. How many more warnings must be ignored before change comes? How many more restraining orders will be broken before protection means something real? And how many more lives must be lost before we finally listen and act when victims say they are afraid? Corneisha Butler's story is not just about how she died. It's about how she lived, as a devoted mother, a hard worker, a woman who wanted peace. It's about the love she gave, the light she carried, and the justice she still inspires. So tonight, as we end this story, let's not just remember the tragedy. Let's remember her strength. Let's say her name, and let's promise never again